Now I'd like to invite Matt Faber to come up to talk to us about transport and health, active transport in New South Wales. So obviously, as Karen has highlighted earlier, there's a lot of co-benefits for active travel in health, environmental and financial benefits. And Matt's been working on active travel for many years. Not just though, he's got a bit of a background in active public and road transport projects in his past. He's in fact been the chief architect of the Western Sydney Rapid Bus T-Way project, which is about to have its 10th birthday, which is a key infrastructure project out between Liverpool and Parramatta, which is a huge piece of infrastructure. So more recently, he's managed the New South Wales Government strategic program of actions to grow the transport modes of walking and cycling. So Matt's currently the manager for the bus, light rail and active transport strategy with Transport for New South Wales. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you to the PCAL for the opportunity to say a few words, and thank you to my preceding speakers, and particularly thank you to Matthew for talking about the southwest sector, because I'm going to talk about the northwest sector, and I'd like to pretend that's a result of intense caucusing in darkened rooms, but it's a happy accident. Look, I am going to talk about certainly going to talk about active transport but as people who know me might not be surprised, I will do that in the context of a particular project. So I'm not down as a case study, but I'm certainly talking about working through from high-level principles such as Norma outlined through to delivery of active and healthy transport outcomes in practice in the context of the North West Rail Link. But first of all, just quickly to those targets. I won't go over New South Wales 2021, the state plan in great detail. Norma took us through that. But it's clear that there are a number of overlapping goals and then targets within or relating to some of those goals that are very relevant to active transport. And I'm a transport planner, I'm a transport bureaucrat who at the end of the day works for the Director General and Minister for Transport, and at the end of the day my success at work is really measured by the degree to which over the next few years we achieve those two indented targets under the second goal. Funnily enough, walking and cycling are for reasons of convenience listed under public transport, although I always like to reinforce that in fact walking and cycling are the most private modes of transport there are. Anyway, I digress. I am at the end of the day measured on the degree to which those targets are achieved. If in a crude sense people choose to walk or cycle because they like how it makes them feel in a physical well-being sense, and we know that is true for people who are taking up walking and cycling. If that happens, and as a consequence a car trip in particular is removed from the network, and also perhaps some pressure is relieved on the most congested inner urban public transport services too. If that happens because people walk and cycle, that's great. We don't care. So in the sense that active transport, healthy outcomes are a reason why people will use active transport, and we can then achieve fairly hard-nosed network efficiency outcomes from that, well, that's great. So that's the overarching plan. In terms of the long-term transport master plan, which Norma did mention, that then goes through and was released as a final document late last year by the Minister for Transport. That goes into those actions that at the transport portfolio level will give effect progressively to those targets for, in my case, walking and cycling, or in terms of what I'm talking about today, walking and cycling. And I've just extracted straight quotes from the long-term transport master plan, just to give you a sense that, and this is very different to other transport plans that I've seen in this state and in this town. It certainly starts to get out there that context of the health-related reasons for why we should be doing what we're doing with active and healthy transport. There's a lot in the long-term transport master plan that I encourage people to look at if they're interested, that has to do with direct and specific programs of actions to promote walking and cycling. There's also going to be a lot more to come. I'm pleased that in the audience today is one of my team, Helen Johnson, who is working on the preparation of a walking plan, which will be one of the modal plans flowing on from the long-term plan. So there's detail in that, and of course there is also a cycling plan that my team is developing as well. So there's more to come. In the meantime, yes, perhaps the last dot point from my point of view as a practitioner is the most interesting of all, and it has to be said it's that's a commitment to work with Treasury, so with the financial purse string holders, to bring some of these principles to bear upon decision making for transport projects. I know that's something that Corinne's going to be talking about more. And I need to be open and honest that we're at the beginning of a journey represented by that commitment. So in that context, I'm interested in talking to you about a particular project, the North West Rail Link, and acknowledging, while there is at the moment and will continue to be for a long while a great debate around the valuation of active and healthy transport outcomes in big transport projects, or in any size transport projects, frankly, that will be debated for a long time, and particularly the way that those values are then reflected in the decision-making process by people like me, who are at the end of the day transport bureaucrats. In the meantime, what we do agree upon is that we know a lot, or we are learning a lot and working out as we go a lot about how to leverage active transport outcomes from those major projects which are being built ostensibly for other reasons than to create healthy communities. It's not to say we can't achieve that from those projects. And there are, of course, very major transport projects flagged in the long-term transport master plan, and the two biggest on, respectively, the fronts of rail and road. Rail is the North West Rail Link, and road is, of course, the WestConnex motorway proposal, which I'm not talking about today, but you can assume that those principles that I'm trying to illustrate with reference to the North West Rail Link are equally of importance, although it might surprise you to know it, to a freeway project, which is essentially predicated on improving freight and commercial network performance. So those projects are big projects. They aim to do as many things as possible. In language that I like to use, they both aim to chase an opportunity that exists in terms of existing transport network usage, congestion, problems with travel time on the existing network. So fixing things up where land use development has already occurred, and they also try to shape a possibility. So on the urban fringe, if we can get, ideally as part of the same corridor that serves a built-up area, we can also then use that to actually deliver service ahead of settlement, such as in the situation that Matthew was talking about in Oran Park, then that's great too. So the North West Rail Link, so Matthew was talking about the bottom left, I'm talking about the top left, the North West Growth Centre and the corridor that connects that to the existing rail network and to what gets called the global arc, the centre of gravity in terms of employment and economic activity that sort of connects Macquarie Park down through North Sydney to Sydney Airport and Port Botany. So the North West Rail Link is, of course, a multi-billion-dollar project with a 10-year delivery time frame, 8 new stations to connect the North West Growth Centre and, importantly, existing settled areas that are about 30, 40 years old in terms of their life cycle, connect those areas to the rest of the city. So in looking at how we realise the opportunity and working towards active transport that project represents, we of course think about where Norma's department has nominated those centres in a hierarchy of nodes that aggregate those activities that people most travel for, so jobs, connections with public transport, services, recreation, etc. And the little, appropriately enough looking like a cherry, the little blob in the middle to the right of Cherrybrook is one that I'm going to talk about in a little bit of depth. And that is, you'll note that what I'm showing there is planned centres for 2036. That little cherry-shaped Cherrybrook blob does not appear on the equivalent map for today. It is not a centre today. In reality, it is, though, an opportunity because it's going to have a rail station. It is definitively an opportunity to look at what centre creating activity can occur with all the potential active and healthy transport benefits that entails. It's a very different situation at the moment, as I'll show in a minute. So we think about the land use, the centres. We also think about what infrastructure is there already that has grown up over time without there ever having been an intention when these first cycleways were built or an expectation that there would be a railway through this corridor. So we work with what we're given. I just make one point with cycleways that it's at a state government level, sort of helicopter level, we can have a view on the cycleway network that exists, but we can't have the same sort of mapped view on the footpath asset that pedestrians use, because the cycleways, for historic administrative reasons, many of them are partly funded through New South Wales government programs because the bicycle is like a road vehicle and therefore, they're road projects, whereas in the scheme of things, footpaths are entirely a local council asset. We expect and to some extent hope that there is a footpath along every road through these areas, but given the vintage of them being very curvilinear and not necessarily connected, it's not always the case. As we work out when we get down to the level of looking at Cherrybrook. I'm being given my 5 minutes, so I'll go very quickly through. The principles of planning the hierarchy of access around North West Rail Link stations are as we would hope they would be. Actually putting those into practice in a way is, though, of course, difficult because in the case of an area like Cherrybrook, we're bringing the railway to a set of suburbs which were built when the car was frankly king. So if you look at existing station access modes for the whole of the City Rail network, we're talking about a mature rail system where most of the stations are located in Edwardian, Victorian era town centres, or at least sort of mid of the last century town centres with a grid street layout around them. Walking is the predominant access mode. People walk more when they're going home, when they've got the time to enjoy the walk and do the other things that they might not have time to do as part of a walking trip on the way to work in the morning. So compared with that sort of 50% mode split for walking access, it's half that in expectation terms for Cherrybrook. That's the reality we're working with, and I'll show you why in terms of an aerial photograph. That's my next slide. However, I do point to the fact that in terms of the longer term development of Cherrybrook, the only way is up. So that's interesting about how we lift over time on the back of this enormous rail project, how we lift that active transport usage. It's not a very good aerial photograph, but it will show you that the station is located in an area where no one ever thought there'd be a railway station there. There's an awful lot of green space, but it's not necessarily oriented to provide access to that node. A lot of that green space is probably golf courses as well, so you've got access and kind of ownership and public versus private space issues. Notwithstanding that, we can map the isochrones around the node to work out in real distance what the walking distance looks like. That blue area is your average 700 metre, 800 metre walking distance that is typical of all RailCorp stations. The interesting thing for me is that big chunk out of the sort of western quadrant of the travel time contours, which is a functioning part of open space and an absence of roads, but also of the barriers created not only by topographical features like creeks, but also by major roads. They do result in then, in terms of people, the expectation of the planners for the people walking into the site, much less from the west than from other areas. That big grey rectangle is a parking station, a commuter parking station, which is part of the project. The inclusion of commuter parking is very popular and well used. but to the extent that it's full by 6:37 in the morning, you'll see the difference. In the morning, you've got maybe 1/4 of people who are walking into the station are coming from that car park. They're walking a very short distance. There are many more of them in the PM peak because they tend to unload in a shorter period than in a later period relatively than the car park fills. So we're working with those figures to look at where people are coming from, and then I'll have to rush through this, but certainly identifying those subsequent works which could address some of those problems of walking access after the event and outside the scope of the rail project itself, which has to draw a line around what it pays for, evidently. But it does presents a reason to identify those deficiencies in the local network, which over time, and we'll talk about this, I guess, in a few months' time in our walking plan, where government can work with the local council to start to address those and start to build up that network around this great opportunity of a rail station. Same is true of cycling. You've got existing in blue and proposed cycleway connections, and a lot where nothing is planned at all, and perhaps, you know, there are issues there of cross-council boundary issues of one council having done its own bike plan and thinking about it in the past, and another council being not so much ahead of that 8 ball. So that's again an area where, in terms of our cycling plan with Transport for New South Wales, we'll be looking at, you know, can we bring to our business rules for any funding we have for 50/50 funded cycleways, can we give weight to opportunities to access a new rail station? Rebecca, I'm on the home straight. Because something that is definitely part of the project is to provide bike parking at the rail station, and you know, I'm one of the few people who gets a bit excited about this stuff, but I can tell you what, we have not been near to being as clever about bike parking at transport interchanges even 2 years ago as to how we are now. What we understand is that the bike market and the market of people who want to lock up their machines at the transport interchanges is very segmented, and interestingly provides a flexibility of access options to the railway station that isn't true in the case of commuter car parking, because commuter car parking, you either get there at 6:30 in the morning or you don't bother. Whereas with bike parking, yes, you might have a very expensive bicycle and want to put it in a locker like I'm showing at the top right there, or you might just want to turn up, maybe you're not even going to catch the train, but you're going to the shops which tend to be near the train. This is my last slide, by the way. So you're locking to a rack, that's a low security. But then the largest picture is what I'm most interested in of all, which is this sort of intermediate model of bike parking where you can lock your bike up to a rail, but then there's this additional level of security where access to that cage, if it's something we end up being able to deliver, could be provided using your Opal card, your single ticket public transport smart card. So that's been a bit of a canter through. Active transport and healthy transport is very much a work in progress for Transport for New South Wales, but I hope that's given you some ideas of the directions in which we're moving, and really look forward to your feedback on those directions. Thanks very much.